Ladies and gentlemen, in the coffee break area, please proceed to the ballroom. We will begin the next session momentarily. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Paris Office Director at the German Marshall Fund, Dr. Alexandra de Hoop-Scheffer.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. This very last panel is going to be dealing with transatlantic security. Transatlantic security is actually at the heart of GMF's work, and actually many of you in the room have actively contributed to our many workshops, publications, policy recommendations dealing with these issues, and we will continue to actively involve you in all of these important debates that GMF has been coordinating throughout the last year. Actually, we opened BMF with a side event on security and defense. Many of you have been contributing. We had a really good discussion. And we also run a GMF-wide program called the Transatlantic Security Task Force, which brings together American, European policymakers, defense industry representatives, academics, experts, our best strategic experts from both sides of the Atlantic to explore current and future security and defense challenges. And we do that two ways. First, by clarifying and identifying the potential divides among Europeans and among transatlantic allies that might lead to suboptimal policies. And then what we try to do together as a group, and with many of you here in the room, we try to move towards better understanding of our mutual security and defense priorities, and we try to move towards, ideally, more common approaches. And if you look at the international security environment today, it gives you a clear sense of the threats and challenges we'll be facing in at least the 5, 10, 15 years to come. Let me give you 3 concrete examples. Number 1, Syria, a dictator that used chemical weapons against its own population, triggered one of the most massive refugee flows and imported terrorism in Europe through the rise of the Islamic State and the phenomenon of foreign fighters. Russia has annexed Crimea, intervened in Syria, and to that extent has become a key geopolitical player with which we will have to cooperate and potentially partner to try and find solutions to many of the crises we're facing today. Lastly, China. China has been building artificial islands in the South China Sea, and yet has also become a key global geopolitical player. Think of climate change, Think of nuclear proliferation. Again, we have to work with China to solve these global issues. And so we are facing all these changes simultaneously. And we've been discussing that throughout the many panels, sessions, night owls of the Brussels Forum. How can we cope with these simultaneous, very complex security, defense challenges? And then you add an additional layer, which is our own domestic, political, economic, social challenges. And when you add all of that together, we have a heavy agenda. And obviously it requires not only a strong transatlantic cooperation, but a strong international cooperation. And so this is going to be the priority of GMF this year and in the years to come, to engage probably even more than under the previous American administration, to engage the US administration on European issues, on what the EU is already doing in terms of security and defense and what it is going to do more, and to engage also on the importance of responding to these challenges in a collective, multilateral way. We had the 1990s so-called humanitarian decade, the post-9/11 expeditionary decade with very mixed results, and now we have entered a much more uncertain era, which will probably last for a few couple of years and decades, an era of strategic uncertainty, or what one of our board members, David Ignatius, called an era of fog of policy. And while we are still in the middle of this fog and are struggling to dissipate this fog, other powers are actually stepping up, intervening, and reshaping regional orders all over the world. In the middle of that, you have the so-called burden-sharing debates among transatlantic allies. This is not new. All of the American administrations have asked Europeans to take more security defense responsibilities. But what is happening now is that you have a widening expectations gap. On the one hand, the narrow focus on the 2% military spending on GDP from the American perspective. And actually, you can rightly see how the transatlantic link is mainly perceived through that particular prism. And on the other side of the Atlantic, Europeans are trying to widen and to promote a wider concept of security, including development, humanitarian aid, economic, diplomatic tools. And in fact, when you look at these two visions, we both need them. We need more defense spending, but we also need, and this is one of the conclusions of our defense security side event we had just last Thursday, we need to have a more integrated, or if I can use the term, comprehensive approach to meet these very simultaneous complex challenges. And so I would just close it up by asking a question and challenge the policymakers around the room. How do we move beyond this burden-sharing debate? How do we reconcile the American and European approaches to security and defense challenges? Because at the end of the day, we're all facing the same challenges, of course with different degrees of urgency, mainly because of geography, but we all face the same international security environment. So how do we move beyond that burden-sharing debate, which puts us in a sort of strategic paralysis, and move towards what I would call a more ambitious project, which is risk sharing? How do we share the risk? How do we cooperate to address this risk? And let's be more creative, let's innovate. Let's think of what are the best formats of cooperation to deal with these security challenges, not only in the transatlantic arena, because we would never succeed to respond to these challenges, Americans and Europeans. We have to also rethink our partnerships with other powers in the world. And this is probably the most difficult part of all of it, because most of these powers, regional powers, local actors, obviously don't always share our long-term strategic interests and even less our values. But that's the challenge. And with that, I would like to introduce Brad Smith, president of Microsoft, for his BF talk. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you. On behalf of my colleagues from Microsoft, it's a real pleasure to be with you this afternoon and to have an opportunity to contribute some thoughts to the very important conversation that all of you are having. What I wanted to talk about today is the growing problem that I think the world is increasingly recognizing around cybersecurity. We see this in the customers that we talk with around the world. 74% of them believe they will be hacked before this year is over. Economists estimate that this will do $3 trillion of economic damage by the year 2020. In fact, we see even problems that are worse than that. Because I think as a company, the problem that perhaps concerns us the most in the cybersecurity space is the growing rise of nation-state attacks. This is something we've seen throughout this decade. I will say for many in our industry, the attack on Sony was a bit of a turning point. Here was an attack by a government against a private company, not aimed at stealing information, but simply sabotaging, vandalizing, disrupting, and even destroying its information infrastructure. Why? Because of the North Korean government's displeasure with the fact that Sony had produced what turned out to be a not very popular movie. We've seen further headlines. We've seen issues around electricity grids and even the fundamental infrastructures of our democracies. And the conclusion that I think comes from all of this, unfortunately, is that cyberspace has become the new battlefield. Conflicts started perhaps on land and then moved to the sea, and after many millennia moved into the air, and now it has been moved to cyberspace as well. But cyberspace is different in some important respects. Because when we're talking about cyberspace, we're actually talking about what is mostly private property. We're talking about data centers and cables that are owned by companies like ours. We're talking about phones and laptops that are owned by people like you. We're talking about servers that are owned by governments or other companies. As a result of all of this, we've discovered that we in the tech sector are suddenly on the front line of these new battles. And not only are we on the front line, we in effect have found ourselves becoming the first responders. Because when a government engages in a nation-state attack on an entity in another country, oftentimes the first to respond is not the other government, but a company like Microsoft or another in the tech sector. In some ways, though, there is one other aspect that I think is more sobering still. Consider this. For 67 years, the governments of the world have recognized and agreed that they have not only a moral obligation, but a legal duty to protect civilians even in times of war. But look at what's happening now. Governments are attacking civilians in a time of peace. This is not the world that the Internet's inventors envisioned a quarter of a century ago. And I think for all of us in this room, it raises one fundamental question. What will we do? I think, in fact, it calls on us to come together, and it calls on all of us to do more. Governments are going to need to do more. The tech sector is going to need to do more, and we are going to need to do more in ways that encourage new forms of private and public collaboration. Certainly as a company, we at Microsoft are focused on doing more. It involves, of course, things like building stronger features in our products. We're spending $1 billion a year to do that. It requires that we make better use of data, as we are. But fundamentally, what we're doing is bringing together the different parts of our company to take all of the data that are coming in, to identify the new malware and security attacks and threats, to reach out to customers more quickly to address them and to remediate them, to use our Cyber Defense Operations Center that literally works around the clock, and with our Digital Crimes Unit, even use the rule of law to disrupt nation-state attacks. That's what we're increasingly doing. Indeed, since last summer, we've been able to go to federal court in the United States. We've been able to obtain control of illegitimate internet domains that were set up by nation-state attackers. And now we've been able to work with over 60 customers in 49 countries in 6 continents. Customers that have been hacked and attacked by a nation-state. That's progress, but one thing remains clear. We are far away from declaring victory. This problem continues to get worse, not better, and we therefore are going to need new steps to be taken. We need governments to come together. We're all accustomed, I think so many of you in this room are even expert on issues like arms control limitation agreements that have applied to many of the world's most serious weapons. Well, when we think of the list of future weapons that we must rank among the most important and serious, we need to put cyber weapons on the list. We need to take a page out of the history book. We need to look at what the governments of the world did when they met in Geneva in 1949 and agreed to create the Fourth Geneva Convention, the convention that obliged governments to protect civilians in times of war. And we need to come together now and consider a new agreement, a digital Geneva Convention. An agreement that would build on the cyber norms that have been developed by governments over the last 15 years in the G20, in UN bodies, in other organizations where there has already been serious thought and discussion. A digital Geneva Convention that would bring governments together to commit that they will refrain in a time of peace from attacking the electrical grid, the healthcare providers, the other infrastructure that belong to our societies. We need governments to agree that they will avoid hacking the accounts of journalists or the private citizens who are involved in the electoral processes that constitute the infrastructure of our democracies. We need governments to agree that they will work together and assist the private sector to maintain the safety of this infrastructure, to report vulnerabilities to vendors, and to exercise restraint, just as they've exercised restraint when it comes to something like nuclear weapons. But we need more than that. We need to take another page out of history. The Geneva Convention came together and worked because it involved what is something of an unusual, if perhaps even unique kind of collaboration between governments and a non-state actor, the International Committee of the Red Cross. And we can also learn from other examples, because what we fundamentally need to do in order to make progress is to start to ensure public attribution of the nation states that are engaged in these attacks. Because increasingly we know who is responsible. But it is not easy when one is a private company or sometimes even a single government to stand up and point the finger and name the name even when there is no doubt what name is involved. That's why we should take another page out of the history book and think about the work of the International Atomic Energy Agency, in an agency that has helped curb nuclear proliferation by having the capacity to investigate and publish findings when a government is violating a treaty. We have the opportunity in this new domain to create a new international organization. It can be a non-governmental organization, but it needs to be a respected, independent, and credible organization with strong technical expertise, diverse geographic representation, the ability to take in information and data from around the world, analyze it, and publish its conclusions so that governments can no longer hide in obscurity when they engage in these kinds of attacks. And then there's one last thing we need to consider as well. In our industry, the global tech sector has the opportunity to come together as well. we operate around the world. We need to operate in a way that is not only responsible, but that takes new steps together to address this problem. We have the opportunity to come together and enter into our own accord, an accord that will bring us together around pledges that will keep people safe. In effect, what we need to advance is a new understanding with every government that as a technology sector, our philosophy is, should be, and needs to be clear that we are committed to 100% defense and 0% offense. In effect, the world will be better served if the global technology sector operates in the sphere of cybersecurity as a neutral digital Switzerland that retains the world's trust. What that means is a few things that are simple but important. I believe that every government, regardless of its policies or its politics, needs a national and global information technology infrastructure that it can trust. And the only way that governments can have this trust is if they recognize that as a global technology sector, we need to be neutral. We need to make clear that we will not aid any government in attacking any customer anywhere. And we also need to make clear that we will assist and protect customers everywhere, regardless of their nationality. Only if we can do that, only if we can create a new organization that can advance the state of the art when it comes to attribution, only if we can bring governments together to put in cyberspace the kinds of rules that have existed for every other form of warfare, will we do what it takes. We won't create a perfect world. There is no such thing on this planet. But that is the only way that we will fundamentally make the progress we need to make to ensure that security, privacy, and safety truly flourish in this new digital world. Thank you very much.
Go first. You guys need to go first. I don't know what I look like. Oh, well.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome anchor for CGTN America, Ms. Asiye Namdar.
Okay. Hello, everyone. We're here today to talk about insecurity between the continents, transatlantic insecurity, and we have a panel of distinguished guests, which I would like to introduce. We have Rose Gottemoeller, Deputy Secretary General of NATO, Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, Henri Schrick, Special Advisor, International Relations, Ministry of France. Last but not least, Soli Özel, Professor at Kadir Has University in Istanbul. I believe as a moderator, I should do minimal talking. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot. I will ask questions. I would love to get you, the audience, engaged as much as I can. I see familiar faces, so nice to have you all here with us. My first question is, US President Donald Trump, when he was campaigning, he called NATO obsolete. Is NATO obsolete? Is NATO capable of meeting the threats of 21st century, especially in regards to terrorism? Rose, I'm going to begin with you.
Well, it won't surprise anyone that I am going to say, yes, of course, NATO can tackle the threats of the 21st century, and has been doing so already. I actually wanted to start out by quoting George Robertson. After the very, very first time that Article 5 was invoked by the alliance, this was after the 9/11 attacks, when George Robertson said, yet again, today, the United States of America can depend on its NATO allies in the fight against international terrorism. This was in 2001. So NATO has been fighting terrorism and fighting it hard in Afghanistan, in Iraq by training the Iraqi security forces. It has been tackling this problem hard. In addition to which, you know that 2014 was a watershed year. That was the year not only that we saw the rise of ISIL and their takeover of Mosul, but we also saw the seizure of Crimean territory by the Russian Federation. And so we've also been responding quickly to that threat by bringing deterrence and defense to bear in Europe once again. The quintessential mission of the NATO alliance, cooperative defense, once again, for the first time since the Cold War, being brought to bear in Eastern Europe rather quickly. So we voted among the allies in Warsaw this past summer to step forward and bring 4 battalions, 4 battle groups to Eastern Europe, to the Baltic states and to Poland. And within the year, they are there. They will be arriving there, and they are arriving there even today, and will be in place by midsummer. So I would say that NATO has been not only responding to the threats of the 21st century, but also when it needs to, casting its eye backward to the 20th century and responding to threats in a very concerted way. So that would be my answer.
Thank you, Rose. Senator, I have to ask you to respond to that. Is NATO obsolete?
Well, absolutely not. And of course, General Mattis, now our Secretary of Defense, said if NATO didn't exist, we'd have to create it. 9/11 obviously was a seminal moment in America. It shocked, I think the world certainly shocked Americans. And of course, what did NATO do? For the first time, it invoked Article 5 and said that we were all under attack, and they responded. Now, there's no doubt about it. In America, foreign aid is probably the most unpopular form of spending. Defense spending is not all that popular either. I mean, we'd rather spend it on ourselves, not having to defend things, but it's absolutely necessary. And so when Americans see repeated reports, for example, that NATO members don't hit their 2%, that kind of concerns them. It creates the kind of public pressure, maybe not to support NATO, but nothing could be of greater folly. One thing that I think Senator John McCain pointed out quite nicely yesterday is NATO, of course, has shown its participation, its support, far more than just what it spends on defense, because its sons and daughters have also sacrificed in the defense of our freedoms, of our liberty, of world security and safety and stability. So it's extremely important to understand the whole equation. But I think one of the messages, obviously, Senator McCain and I brought here, just coming here, was the support, certainly in Congress and I believe in America, for NATO, for the European Union. We are the Western democracies. We are the bulwark that will provide peace and security and safety throughout the world, and we have got to hang together, because this is the most successful alliance in human history that has produced a stable and peaceful whole Europe, and really will help provide peace and stability throughout the world. So no, absolutely, NATO is fully relevant and incredibly important.
Thank you, Senator. Professor, I'd like to turn to you. Turkey, of course, is a member of NATO. It also wants to be part of the European Union. Where do things stand as far as those negotiations go at this point?
Turkey and the European Union.
Yes, sir.
Well, first of all, today is the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome. And I guess the hopes that were invested in that treaty were realized, and then it seems to have gone downhill since then. And I'm heartened by the senator's affirmation that the United States still, or at least the administration, still cares about the European Union, since it really doesn't sound like they do. But I guess the European Union will also have to rise to that challenge.
I'm going to move out of the way in case.
No, it's not. It's, look, my view is, when NATO was founded, or when the Cold War began, we were at a genesis moment. Turkey has played an important part in that genesis moment and how the new world was going to be shaped. We are again in a genesis moment, and there are things that NATO can do, as it does, and there are certain things that I think NATO is not really equipped to do unless it changes the way it looks at things, the way it organizes itself, and what have you. And whether or not the European Union is going to be a partner in those challenges is going to be an important matter. Turkey's relations with NATO have always been far more intimate, I guess, than the relations with the European Union, which is a long history of a lot of bickering, a lot of double talk, but quite frankly, at the end of the day, those relations proved to be very resilient. You asked me about where the negotiations stood. They have been standing in a coma for some time. The good thing about the coma, you can always get out of them. The bad thing about comas is that you may never wake up. Exactly. And right now, there is a lot of uncertainty, and the title of this panel is, of course, A World of Insecurities. And in that sense, I think we will have to see whether or not 60 years on, the European Union will be able to actually reshape itself. And I guess we'll have to wait for the French and the German elections. And then what kind of relation they will want to have with Turkey, as well as what kind of relation with the European Union Turkey will want to have. Increasingly, a lot of people think that rather than looking at the accession process, which itself doesn't seem to be going anywhere, we have to look at other venues where Turkey and the European Union can actually cooperate. That already happened. Despite all the criticism on legal grounds and on ethical grounds, I think the refugee deal has stuck. And there may be other issues on which Turkey and the European Union can work, but both with the EU and NATO, the Turkish complaint is that allies or would-be allies do not necessarily appreciate the kind of threats that Turkey actually faces. And the others claim that Turkey is not sensitive to their concerns. So my view has been for a long time now, both within NATO and in relations with the European Union, Turkey and the allies will have to figure out a new language with which to communicate, because the old language, in my judgment, doesn't really work now.
Henri, let me move on to you. A lot of talk in Europe, around the world, whether immigration policy has created a sense of insecurity in Europe. Does there need to be more restrictions of refugees and immigrants? And I know this is a very volatile, sensitive issue. People either feel strongly one way or another.
Okay, I have to admit I was not prepared at all for that kind of question.
I like to surprise my guests.
I know. You told me before.
Yes.
So thanks a lot for that.
You're welcome.
Do you really mind if I don't really answer your question?
No, you have to. You have to answer to some capacity.
Okay,
I'm counting on you.
No. No, but first of all, I would like to throw some thoughts on maybe defense and security subjects, because what you told us helped me introduce that. First of all, let's discuss a little bit about Russia. I know it's not immigration.
Okay, as long as you answer my question. So
one day.
Okay. No, it has to be today.
Okay, so what about Russia? Russia, is it a threat or a partner? It's difficult to say. At least that's one of the more controversial or splitting subjects, especially in Paris. I do imagine it's the same in the US. It's the same in many countries. So let's go back to 2014, not in the Middle East, but in Ukraine and Crimea. That was a strategic surprise, more or less, for all of us. That was a wake-up call for sure for Europe, for NATO. Why? Because at the tactical level, at least, we didn't see it coming. And what a mistake, I would say. No warning signal, a poor situation awareness. But more important, at the strategic level, that just demonstrates the fact that we have been sleepwalking more or less into the 21st century. At least in the defense domain, for sure in other security domain like immigration and things like that. We didn't see anything coming. And back to defense, I think that until 2014, in most of the countries, defense procurement were taboo words. These subjects were not discussed in general elections. If I take the example of France, I'm pretty sure that 5 years ago will never, I mean, defense matters will never have been discussed in a primary elections, while it was in January in the socialist or left-wing primary debate. So since then, my concern is that NATO and most of the security organizations have been a default mode which is mostly reaction or a reactive mode, and we have to change that. We are trying to demonstrate a cohesion. We are trying to demonstrate our capability to deter, and that's the work of NATO. But maybe, if I want to be a little bit provocative, and I've been discussing that Thursday with some of you already, maybe the only thing we have been demonstrating so far is our fear. Our fear because we do not trust our capabilities yet, or still. We do not think we are up to the challenges of the 21st century. And our cohesion, as a result, is quite fragile. The same applies for immigration, by the way. So that was the dark side of what happened since 2014. What is the light side of it? First of all, defense, procurement, military operations are not anymore taboo words. It's amazing to see all these political leaders being war leaders, I would say, or ready to become war leaders. The other thing I see is any new government feels the need to publish, to advertise its ambitions with respect to defense and security. That means to publish a white book, to publish a strategic review, and so on and so forth. Even the German narrative has changed a lot with respect to military operations. Tomorrow, for example, or tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, German forces or Germany will be the first contributing nation in Mali, in MINUSMA. I'll come to a close. I think that the first thing we have to do, and that applies to defense, that applies to immigration, we have to trust much more what we are able to do. We have to regain confidence and keep in mind that NATO and EU are just tools once we have regained confidence.
Thank you. And my apologies if that question caught you off guard. Your English is excellent, so please don't worry about your English. I would like to get the audience involved in our next question. Let me ask the question first, and you need to go on your gadget, on your iPad, and based on what you say, we'll get the reaction of our distinguished panel. And the question is, who or what do you see as the biggest threat to transatlantic security? Number 1, Putin. Number 2, terrorism, immigration, or Donald Trump? It's technology. Well, those are some very interesting statistics up there. Senator, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Happy to. First of all, let me go back, because you've got immigration listed down there. I would put that as the lowest.
Well, it came as the lowest.
I know, so I would agree with that.
Okay.
You know,
I know what you're not going to agree with.
I'm chairman of Homeland Security Government Affairs. We have 4 top goals, priorities in my committee: border security, cybersecurity, protecting our critical infrastructure, of course that has a cybersecurity component, and combating violent extremists no matter what the cause. So if you take a look at the board, you know, obviously I would put terrorism number 1. I'd put Putin number 2. And the immigration, in terms of the migrant flow in Europe, is a result of the terrorism and, let's face it, Putin's aggression together with Iran totally destroying Syria. So I think you have to look at the root cause of this issue, and rather than, and I think this has been the reaction, the first reaction of Europe is, you know, listen, we are all compassionate. We all have humanitarian goals. But rather than say, let's welcome all the migrants in here, why don't we address the root cause and solve the problem in Syria? Let's try and reduce the flow of immigrants trying to escape that slaughter,
Senator,
that genocide.
I don't mean to interrupt you,
I'm
but
sorry.
these numbers don't reflect what you're saying. at least not in this crowd. I mean,
Well,
Donald Trump and
Donald Trump,
Putin,
that's been whipped up
that's what
by
I
the
want you to
press.
address. Explain that to me.
Well, I guess you can explain it in one word: tweets. Okay, if you want to have, again, if you want to have some comfort, okay, understand. Take a look at who Donald Trump has appointed as Secretary of Defense, as Secretary of Homeland Security. I would argue Secretary of State. He's surrounded himself with people of accomplishment. Secretary Mattis is the one who said if NATO didn't exist, we would have to create it. So I know it's hard, but ignore the tweets. Take a look at the substance. Take a look at the substance of Senator McCain and myself coming here. Take a look at the substance, for example, of Congress 2 Congresses ago voting unanimously, I mean unanimously, for lethal defensive weaponry for the courageous people of Ukraine, and then reaffirming that with the resolution in the last Congress. So we have multiple branches of government. It's not just the presidency, it's also Congress, it's also the leadership of people like Senator McCain, but it's also the leadership of the American people, who, like so many of our partners here in NATO, have sent their sons and daughters halfway around the world to not only defend our freedom, but let's face it, defend the freedom, the peace and stability of people whose cultures have given rise to our enemies. Now, that's what the United States has done. That's what NATO does. That's what our European partners do. So, again, what gives me hope are the people of our countries who have big hearts, who have great compassion, who have sacrificed their sons and daughters and their treasures for peace and stability. Leaders come and go. But what remains constant is the big hearts and the service and the sacrifice of the world population, quite honestly, particularly Western democracies.
Rose, are you surprised by what you see on the screen?
Well, I wanted to give a kind of nerdy answer to this.
You're allowed.
I'm not what you would call an expert on writing surveys, but I do know that a lot in a survey depends on how the question is asked, right? And it's too delicious to put Mr. Trump on the same list with Mr. Putin, terrorism and immigration, and I'm sure the audience had great fun with that. So I'm just calling into question, you know, the Brussels Foreman methodology in this case. I think I would have done the question a little different, thank you very much. But I did also want to agree with Senator Johnson. Again, you won't be surprised probably, but I think it is really important, and we've seen this at NATO, the strength of the national security team in this administration is admirable. Within a very short time of their coming into office, they sent Secretary of Defense Mattis to NATO with, and this has been in the press a lot, so you've heard, yes, he had a very reassuring message. But more than that, he engaged very seriously and intently with the NATO allies, showing that he has roots in NATO. He himself was one of the commanders at NATO for the Transformation Command, so he knows the alliance inside and out, and showed it in the way he had engaged the substance early on in January. And within 3 days, we had Vice President Pence coming, who also, from his time on Capitol Hill, had worked a lot of these issues and was totally engaged with the kind of agenda of the alliance and what we need to accomplish. So I think that's how I'm going to answer this question, that I think you need to check your methodology.
Okay, all right.
A biased poll.
Okay. Professor, I'm going to turn to you. Turkey has a referendum coming up next month. Should the world be worried? Should NATO be worried about the potential results of this election, which many say could make President Recep Tayyip Erdogan more powerful than ever before?
If the result of the referendum is a yes, yes, he will be more powerful than ever.
Is that a source of concern for NATO, for European allies?
Well, I think the European Union is on record, and it has expressed itself, that after a yes vote, they will have to reconsider Turkey's accession negotiations. And if the Europeans, in their usual lethargic, complacent manner, don't do it, I think their publics will put a lot of pressure, and I can see the newspaper doing just that. But I guess recalibrating that relation is not going to be an easy one. As far as NATO is concerned, well, Turkey had 3 military coups in 1960 in 1971 kind of semi-military coup, and in 1980, which was pretty brutal. I didn't hear much of a peep from NATO. NATO actually lived very happily with a dictatorial Portugal, a dictatorial Greece, and militarily ruled Turkey before. I don't see that this would change. It would only change if Turkey did things that NATO as a collectivity did not really like. And that is going to show itself possibly in Syria. Turkey does have a security concern there. It does not want the organization PYD and its militia, which is affiliated with the PKK, against which the Turkish government has been fighting since 1984, to actually create a corridor controlled by it to the south of the border. That is not how the allies see it. It's a legitimate concern, independent of the rightness or wrongness of the Turkish policy vis-à-vis Syria's Kurds, how we handled it and stuff. And those are all generating problems in terms of how reliable the Turks see NATO to be. And my understanding is a lot of people in Washington and maybe in other capitals are wondering how reliable Turkey is for NATO. That is not a good way of being in an alliance. So I will end with what I said in the previous question. That is, we really have to sit down and figure out what it is that actually brings us together. And obviously, we have differences of opinion on many matters. How can we reconcile those differences? You raised your question. The first thing you said: should the world be concerned?
It wasn't trying to be a leading question, by the way. It was just a very honest question. Rose didn't like my other question. Now you don't like this question.
I didn't say I didn't like it.
Okay,
I was just
you were getting ready to say it.
I think a Turkey which is a mediating nation, where Turkey's qualities, what made her very valuable in the first decade of the 21st century, were that it was a secular, democratic, capitalist country with a Muslim population that is a member of NATO and seeking membership in the European Union. That combination doesn't exist anywhere, and that's what made Turkey precious. And in that decade, Turkey appeared to be actually using all those components in a rather agile manner, put it all together. And if Turkey moves away from that, I think it's going to harm its own interests, and I think it is also going to be a problem for the rest of the world, yes. Well, if not the rest of the world, then certainly the alliance.
Thank you, Professor. Before Henri, I want to ask a question about Brexit, but once again, we have one of those polls. So let's put our Brexit poll on the screen. Very easy one. Is Brexit just the beginning? Are we going to see this? Yes. Yes, no, and of course, I don't know. And then I would like, Henri, for you to start, depending on what the answer is. Is Brexit just the beginning? Will other EU countries follow? Wow. Yes, 21%. Nearly 61% no. 17% don't know. So Henri, I have to ask you your reaction first, but I also want you to talk about this wave of anti-establishment populist movement we've seen across Europe. The vote failed in the Netherlands, but what about the rest of Europe? And of course, in your country, you have elections coming up, and the world will be watching.
Well, okay, thanks a lot for the pressure. I feel the pressure. Was it no? I think that the other EU country may not follow as long as it doesn't seem too easy for the UK to negotiate. The real issue is, as I understand it, is that we will have to wait until the end of 2017, I mean the end of the German elections, to know exactly what the discussion is between the UK and the EU. What I fear is this period, this, let's say, 6-month period, when populism may use that because, it looks too easy. Discussing with some friends, let's say in the banking sector, there is another risk there, which is everyone told us if Trump is elected, this is the end of it. The market will fall, things like that. Then, first with the Brexit. So with the Brexit, market may fall. This is the end of Europe. This is the end of London, things like that. 10 months later, nothing has happened. More or less, so the same applied for Trump. If Trump is elected, then people will not trust the US, markets will stumble, things like that. Nothing has happened. So what we can fear today is that people made there to vote for populist party because nothing happened. There is no worst-case scenario happening anymore. Or it looks like there is no worst-case scenario. What I understand, nevertheless, is that markets, for example, are well disconnected from real life, and one day we may have a very bad surprise, the day everyone is waking up. So that's one aspect of it. I think populism is totally different today than it was maybe 10, 15 years ago. So Marine Le Pen, I think...
Is she going to win?
I would say depends who is in the second round. No, it's a tricky question. It's a tricky question because more than 40% of the French population doesn't know yet for who for who won the votes. That's the first thing. Second
You mean
thing,
they're undecided, is what you're trying to say?
Yeah, undecided.
Okay.
The second thing is, looks like many, many young people are ready to vote for Marine Le Pen, which is brand new. At least that's what my kids tell me. They tell me, Dad, you are underestimated how much on the social network young people are supportive of Marine Le Pen. Not sure I like that, but that's the case. So maybe the question is, who will show up on the poll on the day of a poll? That's really the question. So who will show up for the very first round? Because after that, it's too late anyway. So pending who is on the second round, Marine Le Pen will be elected or not. I tried to answer your question. So the future is within the hands of the young ones.
Thank you, Henri. I have one or two more questions, and I'd like to open up for the audience to ask whatever they like, but I'd like to move on to Syria. Very, very complicated issue. Some might argue there are simply too many cooks in the kitchen. Can, at this point, Turkey, Iran, and Russia, with the peace talks in Astana, offer the best chance for peace in Syria? Rose, I'm going to begin with you.
You know, many of you around the room know that I worked for President Obama. I worked for the previous administration. My boss at the time, John Kerry, made a huge run at this issue with Minister Lavrov, worked very, very hard at the diplomacy. I am American enough to believe that there cannot be a serious and abiding solution to conflict, frankly, around the world, unless the United States is involved and using its influence for the good. So I think it will be important, and what has disturbed me about the procedure and processes going on lately is that not all parties are coming to the table. It's always been difficult to convene all of the many groups that are involved because many of them are terrorist organizations, some of them are terrorist organizations, some of them have not been able themselves to get together and agree to join in the discussions, and some are at such opposite sides of the issue that there could be no consensus about their joining the process. So it's been extraordinarily difficult to put forward and carry out a process that I think would hold weight and hold water over time to address the crisis that has ripped Syria apart, the civil war that has ripped Syria apart over the last several years. So I think really we need to look forward at this point. I know the Trump administration is still reviewing its policy and trying to figure out how they want to jump in on these difficult crises, and Syria is only one of a number of difficult crises. We could talk about North Korea, for example. That's another very difficult crisis, but that, of course, is far from Europe. So, but I would say that the mix isn't right at the negotiating table now, and for that reason, I see no hope of it succeeding.
Senator, does the Trump administration have a policy when it comes to Syria?
Well, again, the Trump administration is just standing itself up. We've confirmed some of the secretaries, and we need to staff the administration. Syria's a mess. It's almost hard to, again, I don't want to be partisan, I don't want to look back in history, but in order to solve a problem, you actually have to look at the root cause. And the fact is, however many years ago, about 6 years ago, there were a few hundred Syrians had been slaughtered. Red lines were drawn. We bugged out of Iraq. We didn't leave a stabilizing force behind in that region, which I think would have prevented it from spinning out of control. Now we see a full-fledged genocide. 500,000 people slaughtered by the Syrian regime. And to think that you could solve that problem by negotiation, I wish you could, but I think that's a fantasy. I think it's always been a fantasy. Diplomacy follows facts on the ground. And the facts on the ground are such that Russia and Iran, Hezbollah and Assad have certainly won the engagement in Aleppo. Russia's secured its seaport. ISIS is still in Raqqa. Turkey's problematic. So so the bottom line is you're not going to solve this with diplomacy. Something's going to have to change facts on the ground. We've got to defeat ISIS in Raqqa. The problem is who's going to take out ISIS in Raqqa? Who's going to hold Raqqa afterwards? And that is a vexing, vexing problem. But again, this is just, the problem has degraded. The solutions have gotten worse as we go forward. So no, it's a big mess, and I don't envy the next president or President Trump trying to figure out how to handle it.
So if I could just, if I may, sir, to follow up, if diplomacy is not the answer here, what is?
Well, listen, eventually diplomacy will follow the facts on the ground. But right now, I don't find, let's put it this way, we don't have a satisfactory diplomatic answer from our perspective. From Russia, from Assad, from Iran's perspective, they're happy to have a diplomatic solution right now, freeze it in place. Because, again, they've won the Battle of Aleppo and for basically Damascus. So they're in a pretty good position right now.
Professor, I'll let you respond.
And I can be very honest.
Yes, absolutely.
What were the United States doing in Iraq in 2003? You made, or the United States made Iran the most powerful country in the region. What goes on in Syria today is at least an indirect outcome of what had happened then. So if we're going to blame the Obama administration, we can also blame the Bush administration for having signed the agreement with the Iraqi government to actually withdraw the troops into 2011. I don't think the Obama administration did the right thing, but you are right. They did withdraw, and they created a vacuum. And then Syria exploded. By the way, if we're going to look at things on the ground, the Americans and the Russians on the ground seem to have come to a balance. The United States controls what goes on to the west of the Euphrates River. The Russians control what goes on to the east of the Euphrates River. To the north, Turkey contests certain things, and both the United States and Russia are trying to limit what Turkey can do in the north. The Assad government cannot rule the entire territory. It's still too weak. And so long as you do not have an understanding between Saudi Arabia and Iran as to how this mess ought to be settled, I don't believe the global powers by themselves can actually impose a solution. That's why it is going to continue to be a mess. But in that sense, in terms of to the east and the west of Euphrates, I think there is a kind of an understanding between the United States and Russia. And that's why what the Kurds benefit from, obviously. And they're going to be, so it looks, they're going to be asked to help the United States to actually take Raqqa on. But will that end the conflict? Will that end the bloodshed? It may reduce the amount of bloodshed, but I doubt that you can actually have a resolution of the problem. And I guess you also have to take into account all these local forces. you have basically a serial warlords. Some of those warlords are nominally on the side of the central government, but they really probably are not. And I suppose any political solution will have to have Mr. Assad out, dead or alive, and somebody else will have to replace them with some kind of Sunni, how shall I say, belief that it's going to be a reasonably decent government. Though this is really a very tall order, and I guess it will take a while before everything is falling into place.
I have a few more questions, but at this point, I'm going to zip it and let the audience ask questions. Sir, we need the microphone, I think. Thank you. There you go. And please introduce yourself.
Of course. Thank you very much. NATO, DSG and the Senator both started their remarks by recalling 9/11 and the fact that NATO invoked Article 5 at that moment. My name is Karl Kovanda, and at that time I was sitting at that table as the Czech ambassador. Two questions, I think both of them for the NATO DSG. Number one, at the time, we had difficulties in getting to the point of invoking Article 5. That's a different story. But once we did, the US had great difficulties in figuring out what best use they could do of this step that the NATO ambassadors took. So my first question is, if, heaven forbid, there were a need to invoke Article 5 today anywhere, is NATO better prepared to react to that kind of an invocation? And my second question, DSG, has to do with the role of the military in combating terrorism. There are many who would argue that terrorism is, in essence, a police issue rather than a military issue. And apart from the considerable point, but still a limited one, of depriving terrorists of territory, what role is there for the military as opposed to police forces in combating terrorism? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for those questions. First of all, I don't think he would mind me saying, but I did have a chance to talk with Lord Robertson this morning before I came here, because I wanted precisely to recollect that day with him, and he cast back in his memory, and he talked about it. And indeed, I think it did take the United States a few days to decide exactly how it wanted essentially to use the alliance in that case. You have to, if you live through those days, you will never forget them. I was at the Carnegie Endowment at that time in Washington, D.C., and I remember how Washington was gripped at that moment. So it was the United States adjusting to a profound attack on our national territory that killed over 3,000 people, the first time since Pearl Harbor had been attacked during World War II. So it does, in some ways, it's understandable to me that the decision-making processes in Washington took some time. And so, but I don't think that's the problem for the alliance, because Article 5 was invoked. The questions went out to Washington, how can we help? Within a couple of days of when Washington said, okay, we want your help in this way and that way and this way, AWACS planes of NATO were flying over US airspace and helping to protect US airspace. So once the alliance basically, learned what Washington wanted it to do to help with this profound attack on US territory, the NATO alliance responded quickly. Can we do better? We must do better, because nowadays the threats are more unpredictable, the pace is faster, the threats come at us from directions we can't predict. We haven't talked about cyber warfare, we haven't talked about the hybrid phenomenon yet today, but we really must be prepared to respond more quickly. And for that reason, NATO is at the present moment undergoing a review of our command and control systems and how we look at these very sets of decision-making problems. And it will be a very active discussion over the next several months. I don't know exactly where we'll come out, but it's with this set of issues in mind.
And Rose, before we go to the next question, I want to ask you a question about NATO enlargement. Your thoughts on that? There's a critical vote coming up in Congress next week. Talk to us about that, and then we want to get the senator involved in that conversation as well.
Yes, the alliance is committed to NATO enlargement. We have been continually working the problem over a number of years at this point, and Montenegro is next up. By the way, I think it is important that NATO will be focusing its attention in this arena in the Western Balkans, because there are many, many issues affecting the security and stability of the Western Balkans at this moment. So it's a very good thing that Montenegro is next up. 25 NATO countries have already completed their ratification processes, and I've been very, very glad to hear just in recent days that the U.S. Senate is about ready to move out on this. But if I may, I'll turn to Senator Johnson, because he's much better equipped to talk about this issue than I am. So, Senator.
Rose, I was actually fortunate to chair the Ascension hearing on Montenegro, and we did that in the last Congress, hoping to get that passed by unanimous consent. We had a couple senators who didn't want that, but I really don't see any problem. We're going to hold the cloture vote, followed by the final vote, probably either Monday or Tuesday, to get that done. And it's crucial we do it. We know that Russia basically tried to incite a coup inside Montenegro. And again, that fledgling democracy stood up to that. Obviously, Russia has tried to influence American elections. Their propaganda, their disinformation campaigns are pervasive, and we can't reward that by not voting to make sure that Montenegro becomes part of NATO.
Senator, thank you. Rose, thank you so much. Question.
Mary Fitzgerald. I'm a researcher specializing in Libya. And yesterday we had the head of AFRICOM saying that they were watching with great concern Russia's growing engagement with Libya and specific Libyan factions that are opposed to the UN-backed Government of National Accord in Tripoli. Last month we saw the British Defence Secretary trade barbs with his Russian counterpart on this issue. Michael Fallon said he believed that Putin was trying to test the NATO alliance in Libya. This is a question specifically for Rose and Henri. How worried are you about Russia's growing role in Libya, growing assertiveness in Libya? And what do you think are Russia's intentions in Libya in the short and long term?
Henri, you go first.
I'll make a very short answer. I think I'm not afraid at all. I think that we tend to forget that Russia used to be in the area. What I remember from my very first days in the Navy is that Russia was everywhere. Soviet units were everywhere, and then the Russian ones. We tend to forget that, but they're just back. They are just back where they were before, trying to gain the same harbors, bases, and that's it. So it's really up to us to keep or to regain control of the approaches, land, maritime, air approaches. It's up to us to make sure that these neighboring countries still want to work with us. But we are just back 30 years, something like that.
Rose?
Let me mention that we have received a request from the Prime Minister in Libya to go there and to begin NATO training. So I think NATO is looking for ways to help in Libya, and we will look to develop capacity there. We will look to, in responsible ways, build up the national institutions there. That's what NATO can do and can do very well. We've been training the Afghan National Army, for example, and doing a great deal to develop the capacity in countries such as this that have experienced great instability and need to have that national capacity. Libya needs it. The trouble that I have with what's going on with Russia right now in Libya, I am very concerned about Russian forces seemingly gathering to influence the situation there. It troubles me very, very much. But to me, the core of the issue is a rule of law problem, because NATO is long-standing and respected member of the UN Security Council. Russia voted on a UN Security Council resolution to set up certain processes in Libya to move again toward a government of national unity and to build those institutions and to get Libya, again, in a very difficult circumstance, but moving in the right direction. And it seems to me, looking in from the outside, that there was a decision made in the Kremlin to simply toss out that UN Security Council resolution and proceed forward in a way that is unpredictable. So it's a rule of law problem from my perspective, and it worries me very much. But NATO's got to be ready, I think, to go in and help in whatever way we can, and assuming we find the right partners, of course, to build up Libya's institutions again.
Can I just quick chime in? You know, I think Libya is just another example of what happens when, you know, if you break it, you own it. And if you topple a regime, you better be prepared to go in and stabilize the situation and be there for the long haul. And that's what we didn't do in Libya. And you know, to your answer in terms of what role the military plays, well, we cannot allow these failed states to be safe havens for terrorism. That's why we had to destroy ISIS, deny them that caliphate, because every day that caliphate continues to exist, ISIS is perceived as a winner. They'll continue to inspire the types of homegrown terrorism that we've seen in America, in Britain, in France, in Brussels. You know, I don't like the reality. I wish Islamicist terror didn't exist, but it does. And it's going to, of course, require a military response. But again, if we're seeking to topple a regime, we better be prepared to stabilize afterwards.
All right, we have a question. Go ahead, sir. Introduce yourself, please.
Christopher Marshall from Berlin, Germany, journalist. I want to get back to Turkey, and I'm very thankful to the professor that you already said what would be the consequences of a yes vote for the Turkey-EU relationship, at least if the EU takes itself and its criteria seriously. I mean, if this referendum ends with a yes, that means that Turkey is no longer a state of law with a division of power, an independent judiciary, and so on, which is a criteria for accession talks. So if we take ourselves serious in the EU, that would be the end. Shouldn't the Turkish public know in advance that this is also a vote whether the talks with the EU can go on or have to stop? And of course, we have the fallback situation that that Turkey stays a NATO member, and we have that before, that Turkey is a reliable NATO member, has military rule or whatever. But on a broader note, Senator, you talked about Montenegro. Is it such a good idea with no side effects if an unstable country, which could have been almost overthrown the government, will be inside NATO and might block NATO conversations when it's inside and not longer outside?
Those are tough questions. Whoa. Oh, okay. There you go. Sit down. It's not your turn yet. Okay. No. Sit down. It's not your turn. They have to answer the question.
Oh, yeah. Where are we starting?
No. Please go ahead. You go ahead, please, Professor.
Well, first of all, the referendum has not yet taken place. So don't prejudge it. There may be a no vote. In fact, the polls are really in dead heat, yes and no. And if there is a yes vote, the Venice Commission report suggests that this is not really, again, up to the criteria of a democracy that the EU would accept. Whether or not the Turkish public ought to know, there are people who write about this. I don't know how many of us are read by the public. But if the Europeans are going to make a point of that, I think they would also have to reconsider the attitude, the tone, and the language that they use in order to warn the Turkish public about this. So often, I think the Europeans mix or allow their sentiments about the Turkish government to get in the way of their desire to communicate with the Turkish public. And when that happens, the Turkish public also turns deaf, I think. And I don't know how to solve that problem, honestly, but that does generate a problem. My hope is that whatever the result of the referendum and the heat of the moment is gone, both sides will be able to actually sit down and reconsider. As I said, I think, let's just be realistic. Accession,
come on,
if I live long enough, maybe I'll see it revitalized, okay? Maybe. So that's not, but there are other ways I don't think it is an option for the European Union to behave as if Turkey did not exist. I also happen to think that it is unimaginable for Turkey to behave as if the EU didn't exist. So how do we recognize mutually our existence is going to be the issue in my judgment.
Rose, Senator, I don't know, you may want to respond to this gentleman.
I wasn't quite sure exactly the point you're getting at. I will say, from my standpoint, NATO is a defensive alliance. It really threatens no one. And in order to join NATO, you have to go through a membership action plan. You have to do an awful lot of things. Just proving yourself, you're going to be valuable to NATO. And from my standpoint, the more the merrier in NATO, because we really threaten no one. And so, no, I'm totally supportive of Montenegro's ascension.
If I could just add
Yes.
one word on that, I just wanted to express my admiration for the way that Montenegro has handled the aftermath of the coup. They have again used every instrument of their judiciary and legal system in order to properly investigate this matter. That's why I think the international community has some confidence already in the outcome of their investigation. So just a quick point on that.
We have a question right here.
Thank you very much. My name is Kali Agassi. I am from Turkish Business and Industry Association, TÜSİAD. Well, there is a smaller problem in terms of people involved and territory involved and violence that is not even involved, but in the same area, and involving people of different languages, ethnic and religious backgrounds, and it's a long-standing problem, is Cyprus. And the West, in a nutshell, badly needs a good success story, and the Nobel Prize Committee needs a tangible achievement, at least this year, maybe. So what about Cyprus? Can it be really, can it have a game-changing effect on all the things that we are talking about, at least a success story for the West, for democracy, to overcome, finally, a struggle between two people of different backgrounds? And if the question is yes, what can we all do? What can you all do? Thank you.
Thank you. Who are you directing your? Okay. Who would like to go first? Anyone?
Well, I can start again. Okay. Cyprus is not a NATO member. However, they are a member of the EU. I wanted to mention that yesterday we had a meeting of the PSC and the NAC, the North Atlantic Council, yesterday, where we brought together members of NATO and the EU, and Cyprus was there, obviously, and intervened in the course of the discussion. But what was so great about the session for me was how rich the EU cooperation with NATO is turning out to be. After we had some decisions over the past year, culminating in foreign ministers meeting in December, and 42 projects were launched that are really making a big difference to European security. To come back to the ambassador's question, he's left the floor, but we are, using military force in cooperation, EU and NATO, to help out with the coast guards in the Mediterranean Sea to help deal with the migrant crisis. And so those are some very tangible and real ways NATO and the EU are already working together to tackle the migrant crisis. Not the only answer by any means, but it's an important way that military forces can be used in this challenging arena. I would say that in answer to your question, my view is yes, and the diplomacy has looked more hopeful over the last year and a half or so, if the issue of Cyprus can be resolved in the coming year, I think it would be further beneficial to the cooperation between NATO and the EU.
We're running out of time, so there's a gentleman here who has a question.
Gentleman here, my name is Alexander Grushko, I'm Russian ambassador to NATO. Well, two remarks. First of all, I would like to say that, of course, we know that Western world face today a lot of problems, but we see also that in place of trying to find solutions of the problem, a lot of people are trying to assign these problems to Russia, to certain conspiracies, theories, etc., etc. Point two is about Montenegro. If we know that Montenegro society is very heavily divided on NATO membership, why not to have a referendum and to make the picture more clear for everybody? Third element. and this is the most important one. On 9/11, President Putin was the first who called President Bush and saying that Russia is prepared to render any assistance to the United States. He was not referring to Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, by the way. And this support was provided. It was critical for U.S. operation in Afghanistan. And this was a demonstration that in new security environment, it will be not possible to build security, peace, stability on the basis of the concept of island of security. Today, neither United States, nor Russia, nor NATO, nor EU are not in a position to do it.
Ambassador, your question,
Yes,
please.
my question will follow very soon. What NATO is doing today does not correlate with this vision of new security environment, because with the placement of additional weapons and equipment systems on the eastern flank, it will not increase security. In terms of cooperation, NATO has frozen all practical cooperation with Russia that was absolutely critical for European and our global security. And now we see that NATO is moving closer and closer to the formula of First Secretary General ISMI. What is NATO? NATO is about to keep Russia out, United States in, and Germany down. I will not talk about the third element of that formula.
Good question,
but
please.
I think that does this new vision of NATO do really correspond with new security environment?
I think we got a question there. Thank you.
There was a pony in there somewhere. No, I must say, Ambassador Grushko was a greatly respected colleague, and we worked together really very, very regularly in the NATO context. And that gets to the point that I wanted to make in answering his question. But first, I want to make the point about NATO being a defensive alliance. This is something that Senator Johnson already talked about earlier. The response that we have undertaken since the seizure of Ukrainian territory in 2014, we really underscore constantly, is defensive and proportionate. So the 4 battle groups that are coming into the Baltic states and Poland are just that. They are based on battalions. And it's not, bringing an offensive combined armed force to face the Russian Federation. That is not the idea at all. It is to be defensive and proportionate in how we respond strongly to the challenges that we feel that Russia poses at the moment. But the other and very important point about what was decided at Warsaw, the summit last summer, was that we needed dialogue as well, that we must engage in order to try to look for ways to ensure that if we're going to get into a crisis emanating, for example, from an air incident or a sea incident around the Baltic Sea, that incident doesn't spiral into conflict. So it's a responsible thing to also be working in every way we can on dialogue with Russia.
Senator wants to respond, and unfortunately we're out of time.
Yeah,
So,
Listen, I appreciate the fact that Vladimir Putin called up President Bush on 9/11. But there's no conspiracy behind the fact that Russia invaded Crimea. They've invaded Ukraine. Their missile system blew down a commercial airliner. They have precision bombed hospitals and relief convoys in Syria. Now, from my standpoint, I wish Russia had accepted the outstretched hand of the West after the fall of the Soviet Union and got fully integrated and are not aggressively threatening their neighbors, destabilizing them, engaging in propaganda, disinformation in America, in Montenegro, in Eastern Europe. So the facts, these aren't conspiracies, these are the actions. So I look forward to a day when Russia stops threatening its neighbors, stops its aggression, and actually does accept that reach down hand, and we can no longer be adversaries, but at least friendly rivals. So the West is there, we'd like to do that, but it's going to first be preconditioned on Russian behavior.
Thank you, Senator. And thank you all for taking part in this lively discussion. Apologies, we've run out of time. Thank you, thank you. And now my friend Ali Aslan is going to come and say a few words.
Thank you. Thank you. Big round of applause to Asya and Amdara for a wonderful moderation, I believe. Wonderfully done. Thank you, Leigh. Well, ending on a light and harmonious note. Wonderful. This is what Brussels Forum is all about. Ladies and gentlemen, we are almost done. We're almost done. Almost the end of 3 very intense days. Many points have been raised. Obviously, many points discussed, many recurring themes. And I do know that the GMF is placing great value in your feedback, obviously. And you know the drill. The forms will be sent out, and you'll be asked to send it back in, and they will be carefully looked at and re-evaluated. But think about that. When Brussels Forum 2016 took place, a president by the name of Donald Trump was just a mere vision, probably even a joke around this time. I remember some panels were made. Brexit, far on the horizon. So I don't want to get into what's next and what's ahead. What do you expect for Brussels Forum 2018? I think we all learned our lessons, not to make any predictions and trust any polls. But I do want to take this one last opportunity because, as I said, your feedback will be taken into account most definitely in writing. But while I have you all here and your attention, I do want to get 2-3 voices before I hand it over to Karen Domfrey to get your sense about, this is your chance to give me a quick assessment, quick impression of what you thought was either the highlights of the Brussels Forum 2017, or you can also voice criticism, pick upon the one question that I asked previously. What was, in your opinion, the topic that was most under-discussed, perhaps? One lady came up to me in the hallway and said, for instance, climate change. Never came up, and if we don't address climate change, all the other problems that we've been talking about in the past 3 days are just moot. So let me see, who wants to chime in here before we put a lid on Brussels Forum 2017? If you wanna voice your praise, now is your time. If you wanna also issue some criticism, this is also the time. If you want to share some notion that has not been discussed whatsoever and you feel is completely essential to be squeezed into Brussels Forum before we all board our planes and go back home. Let me see. You've been most engaging up until now, so now is not the time to be timid. Go ahead, please.
Danya Khatib, I think the best session was the one on the future of American power, because there is a lot of uncertainty about what role America will take in the world. Thank you.
And the role of America, obviously, quite pivotal. Senator McCain has been here with us throughout the session and will continue to discuss America's role. Certainly within the next 12 months. Don't want to trip over you, but I want to hand over the mic here to this young lady from.
Thank you. I'm actually here from Canada, and I wanted to kind of speak on behalf of everyone, but specifically the Young Professionals Forum, saying that it was fascinating kind of seeing the perspective where we're at, where we have to go, and kind of how we can work together with the previous generations to meet these challenges.
And the young professionals were already presented yesterday here in this plenary, and certainly that program, I believe, will continue. Certainly a lot of talent that perhaps GMF can make even better use of in the future, get a young voice on the panels, perhaps in the future. That's also came up a couple of times. Kevin.
I just thought, first of all, the young professionals I thought was an excellent dynamic to this group. I was really happy to see them and couldn't be prouder of the comments they added. But a lot of this forum was really about security, and I counted 3 people in uniform over the 3 days. So I think you could use a lot more voices from the military leaders for all the countries involved, as well as the people that we were talking about most of the time aren't here. The Trump voters, the Brexit people. I know it's hard. There aren't that many Trump people in office yet to bring here, to invite to a forum like this. So maybe by next year they'll be appointed and they'll be on these chairs in the middle of the room.
But indeed, you raise an important point, Kevin. A common theme that's been coming up also when I talk to people is indeed, as much as it might hurt, bring in the Trump supporters, bring in the Brexit supporters, bring in the AfD politicians from Germany and the Marine Le Pen supporters. We want to hear from them. We want to engage them in a discussion and perhaps show them why and where they're wrong. Let's get in a few more voices here.
I didn't realize I had raised my hand. This is my first time at Brussels Forum. I found it really terrific. I thought the strong points were 2 things. One was the discussions yesterday where we were tying together our domestic political and social problems, the discussion about the future of work and the nature of our populisms in our various countries. And I think it's an important integration of the foreign policy discussion, which I think in my country sometimes gets segregated from the domestic policy discussion. And I thought we did some good integration of these various elements here yesterday. And then I think it was also especially important to have here some dissident voices from countries that don't have the opportunity to have this kind of public, free and open discussion. Opposition leaders from Belarus, from Azerbaijan, and from a beleaguered tiny opposition in the Hungarian parliament here. I think that was all very important.
Thank you. Handing over the mic right next.
My name is Dalibor Kodjarevic. I'm coming from Montenegro, and first of all, I would like to thank to the three speakers, high-level speakers, who have very warmly talked about Montenegro, and in that way also trying to support the resolution of the current political crisis. Secondly, all of the compliments for the organization, and talking about the possibilities of widening some of the issues. I think and this bothers me. We are talking a lot about security, and very often this has been highlighted here as well. We are sort of losing the balance between the security and democracy. In the Western Balkans, we have that already called stabilocracy. And how do we find that balance? How do we parallelly build democracies and also keep the security? Thank you.
Thank you. I think these comments pretty much reflect that even though you can have three fully packed discussions, there's still, of course, a lot of topics to be discussed. Some people feel that in this topic was not being addressed, that, of course, is in the nature of the constraints, time constraints that you have. But I think the Brussels Forum 2017 raised many points, many headlines, addressed many of the current challenges, and will continue to do so. And of course, the GMF will be happy to hear from you, get your input, so that Brussels 2018 will perhaps be even more dynamic and more controversial. So with that, I thank you for your attention. This is my last time here on stage, so I'm glad and relieved now to hand over the mic to finally end this off, the Brussels Forum 2017, to the president, of course, of the German Marshall Fund for the last time, Karen Donfried, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks so much, Ali. So I'm the one who does bring Brussels Forum 2017 to a close, or to use Ali's language, I'll put a lid on Brussels Forum 2017. And I think it's been quite a ride. We've covered a lot of topics, and I think it was always riveting. I think it was occasionally uncomfortable, but I think there's a lot of food for thought for us to take with us. And I was thinking back to when Walter Russell Mead, and I saw Walter sitting back here, opened this up on Thursday. And Walter, you said, we are living in a world that doubts the post-1945 accomplishments. And certainly we are witnessing the rise of authoritarian rulers. We've got renewed geopolitical uncertainty. We've got increasing inequality. And all of those things have been commented on over these past 3 days. And we also were reminding ourselves that this is the 70th anniversary of the Marshall Plan, important for my organization. But if we think back to the 1940s, and we think about Dean Acheson, who at the time said the future was in a fog. And I think today maybe the present is in a bit of a fog as well. And so that Acheson quote feels so relevant to our own times. And the question for us is, what's the answer to that uncertainty and that instability? And the answer in the 40s was boldness and optimism and pragmatism. And what we want to do is encourage all of us to strive for that now. And when we were planning Brussels Forum this year, there were two things that we wanted to achieve. One was to make clear that complacency is not the prescription for the times we live in. And Walter, thank you. I mean, you hit that note very soundly on Thursday, that complacency is not the prescription. So we were trying to make the case that concrete actions are the prescription. And after listening to all of you, I'm certain no one here is suffering from complacency. We've talked about a way forward in security hotspots from the Middle East to the Caucasus to North Korea. We've talked about how you can create a world where people have opportunities for work, prosperity, and a better life for their children. We've talked about how to make technology a positive force in our societies. We've discussed ways of renewing faith in our democracies. But I do think many people in this room doubt our ability to change the trajectory that we are on. And I'm thinking back to that poll that we took on Thursday, where we were all asked whether we think our actions can change this. And I was so struck that more hands went up when people saying, no, I don't believe that. So we're doubting our own agency in this. How can that be? And I would say we clearly haven't come up with a concrete blueprint of all of the challenges we're facing and how we're going to address each of them. But I do think all of these discussions have bared actions that can be part of meaningful solutions. And in each of these issue-specific conversations, you all have put forward ideas that we can implement. And so part of the message is act on these ideas. Now, on the NATO front, from Senator McCain and Senator Johnson, they both have talked about their determination to have the U.S. Senate move forward with Montenegro's accession to NATO by ratifying that accession protocol. That is a concrete action. We had the mayor of Ithaca, New York, talking about removing an old couch from a front porch in Ithaca. That image, that action is a useful metaphor for all of the rest of us. What's the couch that you're going to move? What's the couch that we can move collectively? And as the mayor was speaking, he said, he was talking about himself as an elected official, and he said, if I can't be trusted to fill potholes, how can we be trusted to build multilateral institutions? So each of us has potholes we can fill. And I hope Brussels Forum is helping you reflect on what those concrete actions are. What are the areas where you and your colleagues do have the agency and can act? Now, our ability to have this conversation can't happen without all of you in the room taking part in the conversation, can't happen without all of the partners who've helped us bring this about. It's Deloitte, it's Daimler, it's the federal authorities of Belgium, it's our forum, our associate, our dinner partners. It is also very much all of my amazing colleagues at GMF. And I can't acknowledge all of them. But, of course, my bosses are all of my wonderful board members who are here. But the boss of Brussels Forum is not the person standing up here. It is the unbelievable Nicola Leitner, who is sitting back there. And Nicola and I are going to ask all of you to hold each other accountable for following through on the specific ideas that have been put forward over these past few days. And because I do represent the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I want you to take the spirit of the Marshall Plan and let that spirit inspire you. Think about the bold vision, the bold ambition that was there 70 years ago. That did change the world, and you all have agency to make a difference. Thank you for being here, and on to Brussels Forum 2018.